You rattle off everything on your sort of pro-family wish list. It does not bring fertility back to 2. You don't want the person to be like, I'm an ex-coal miner, 70-year-old man with a felony record. But being able to be good with kids is not actually necessarily something you have to go to school for. If people want kids, they have kids. And they are willing to overcome the difficulty. And then, for people who can't afford to comply with that, there's these unlicensed ones that aren't following any of those rules anyways. You've created this huge black market for daycare where people are like, I don't have a license, but I'm really good with kids. During COVID, you had Florida and California get into this big thing about, oh, Florida, we're pro-freedom and all that. California's fertility rate is 152, Florida's is 157. They're basically the same.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. This week, I speak with Noah Johnson, who's a friend of mine from grad school. And Noah has spent years thinking about fertility issues and the different policy measures that states, regions, and countries can try to use to encourage and incentivize people to have more kids. So why is this a big issue? Well, because this conversation takes place against a backdrop of rapidly dropping fertility rates in many developed countries around the world. It's an issue that a lot of states and countries are deeply worried about. Because when your total fertility rate drops below what we call replacement level, that's 2.1, that's the number you need to sustain a population at its current size, the population starts to shrink. You have fewer and fewer children. You have more and more old people. You have a shrinking society. And this will lead to all types of negative side effects and secondary issues that countries really haven't faced before in the history of the world. In these conversations, I've talked a lot about housing. We've talked a lot about different policy issues. But really, the future comes down to people. And if we do not have a robust, vibrant society, that will dramatically reshape what California looks like in the future. So Noah and I talk a lot about this, what it takes to try and encourage people to have more children. The unfortunate story is that there isn't really a silver bullet from a policy perspective. But then he and I also broaden the conversation to talk about the future of the state, governance challenges, and what he hopes for the future of California. So I had a lot of fun. I'm sure you will too. As always, subscribe either here, wherever you're hearing this, or at CaliforniaFutureSociety.com. With that, here's Noah. Well, Noah, I'm excited for this. Excited to have you on. You've been on my list, and we've talked about this a million times, it feels like, in various forms. And now we're actually doing it with mics in front of our face and recording it. So excited to have you on. Tell us a bit about yourself and your connection to California.
Well, I'm born and raised in California, educated in part by the state of California. Went to University of California for undergrad, got a master's at Georgetown, then came back and got a PhD in California at the Rand Graduate School. And I wrote my dissertation on California's paid family leave program because I had my first and second child while living in California and reflected a lot on the benefits of having it, not just financially, but emotionally and mentally. And so I decided that that's what I wanted to write my PhD dissertation about. And now I'm on the job market looking for something else to do while finishing out my time working for Medicare.
And I was thinking back to our time in grad school together. One of the things I was laughing about was I think it was in like the first month or so, you made like a fake campaign poster about me. It was like, I think my face on like a Mitt Romney circa 2012 type body, channeling that kind of, American ideals. So you have a sense of humor as well. You're not your average statistician or data scientist.
That's right.
Well, tell me about, let's talk about this topic of like families and family leave and children. I feel like there's multiple angles to it. There's like a macro fear around total fertility rates and everyone kind of freaking out about it. And what does this mean for society? And then there's these like very more down to earth, pragmatic, like how the heck do I afford daycare? Where do I send my kid to school type of anxiety that maybe you and I just feel that because we're in that cohort of parents. You have your 2 kids. I have a second on the way.
Right.
But it also doesn't feel like questions my parents freaked out about in the same way. It feels like there is a fundamental shift, like parenting is just harder. And so let's talk about those dynamics and like the state of parenting today.
Well, yeah, let's start with the first one, which was about the crisis of fertility. And you have this pronatalism movement, and you're seeing it around the world in places like Singapore, Taiwan, China, Japan, South Korea. You have these ultra low fertility rates, like close to 1. And what got me sort of into what I ended up doing was I thought, oh, parental leave, in part what interested me about it was not only had I just used it, but I thought, oh, it's super relevant because it obviously would induce people to have more kids if you make it easier when someone has a kid. And what I found super interesting was the literature doesn't really support that. So in some of the places where fertility is the lowest, you actually have some of the most generous policies because they're so desperate to do anything to turn around their fertility. And you don't know what the counterfactual is. Like maybe it would be even worse in South Korea than 0.9 if they didn't have those sorts of things. But clearly, parental leave for both mother and father, subsidized daycare, baby bonus check, all these sorts of things. You rattle off everything on your sort of pro-family wish list. It does not bring fertility back to 2. So there's this sort of the follow-up to that is this thing called the gender equity dividend, which says it cannot be policy alone. You also have to have culture. Women do not want to, once they have tasted the freedom and independence of going to school and having a job, they do not want to be a homemaker anymore. And so you have to sort of reorient your society around helping women succeed in the workplace, have more than just around the birth, but have daycare so that kids can go to school and have that be affordable while women work. You need to have the men in their lives also pick up some of the housework, like in a lot of these places with ultra low fertility, if you look at, hours spent doing domestic production, folding laundry, doing dishes, the ones with low fertility often have the lowest male contribution. One of the things that the United States actually does relatively well is men's participation at home. We actually are above the OECD average on that, even though we're way below on a lot of the sort of standard policy interventions. So there's sort of that, which is sort of interesting, which is, the only times they found policy to affect fertility was a couple of cases in the former Soviet Union where these countries had such low fertility, they're willing to do anything to increase it. And it's like, sure, if you give someone basically a subsidy of, let's call it $100,000 a year if they have kids, like that's enough money that you're going to move the needle because they're like, okay, my housing is paid for, I don't have to work, blah, 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 blah. Sure, I'll have another kid. But that's just not a sustainable way of boosting fertility. So that's sort of, I think, at the macro level.
Well, and
you
real
want to
quick,
jump in?
Yeah, before we dive into some of those more specifics on both the policy front and the cultural front, maybe the question I should have asked as well to start is like, why is fertility rate and children such a big concern? I'm thinking about the future of California, but you hear some of the rhetoric around the pro-natalism movement, and people talk about it like it's an existential threat to society. Why is that? Why is it not just, oh, the numbers are low, but maybe they're going to go back up in the future? Talk more about some of the big picture implications before we get into some of the specifics.
Well, I think that the reason that some people get really worried about it is there's a couple things. One, economic growth and population growth are one and the same, right? Like, I mean, that's an oversimplification, but the more people you have working, the more contribution you have to GDP, the more people you have making things and providing services. So there's a huge economic component to it. And I think there's a cultural crisis. I think that people at the cultural level are like, there aren't enough of our people anymore. And so I think that, you see, there's also, I mean, some of it I think is intertwined with religiosity. I think you see some of it as like concern about, in certain communities, there's like a belief that, you have a moral responsibility to have more children and from their faith. And so there's a crisis in that where it's like, Catholics are a classic example. It used to be that there was a stereotype that Catholics had 12 kids because it's a moral imperative, and they just don't anymore. And I think that that weighs on some people from a cultural perspective. So I think that's why. And then honestly, from a geopolitical one, people I think sometimes China has 1 billion people. We only have 350 million. How can we compete forever? If they catch up on a productivity basis, then their economy will be more powerful than ours because they just have 3 times as many people. So I think there's that. I would just jump in and follow up with what you were saying about like the ease of parenting and like overcoming things. It's so expensive. What I find super interesting about this conversation is like people with PhDs like us, and I think in our our level of education and income, there's a lot of this thought that it's like, oh, well, it's too expensive to have kids. Typically, poor people have more kids than rich people. And so clearly it's not affordable. If you want to have kids, you find a way to make it work. And so this is, I think, the interesting thing about the policy intervention too, which is that it's like, if people want kids, they have kids, and they are willing to overcome the difficulty. I mean, I was just talking to a guy that was doing a termite inspection for me. He has 6 kids. Okay. My household income is way higher than his, but he wanted to have a lot of kids. So he and his wife
Yeah.
had 6 kids, and so I think that there's this bubble that certain people live in that it's like, oh, cost is the problem, but it's not, in that people who, maybe that's a philosophy. Like maybe some people who are wealthy were like, if I had more money and I could continue living my lifestyle, I would have a 3rd kid. I would get a nanny, the schools would be good, and I could get a bigger house and a minivan. I would have another kid. But that is not how the majority of people look at their fertility decisions.
That's really interesting. And, I think that cost of living factor and the money factor, I want to dig into that and the psychology around that, because that's where I feel like some of the challenges are uniquely Californian, right? The phenomena we've been talking about, if not completely global, it's pretty widespread. There's a lot of countries grappling with this question. And it's not just California as well. It's other states in the United States are also grappling with this question and this issue of lowered fertility rates. But in high cost coastal areas, there's no more coastal expensive place than California in the country. Some of the psychology
Right.
around money and affordability become more prominent. And I want to throw out my first theory, but I want you to then to like respond to it and tell me more. Part of it I feel like is intergenerational, like a feeling of loss of relative wealth to how you grew up. So,
Right.
people grew up, let's say they're from California with a certain standard of living. Now, 30 years, 20 years later, when it's their turn to start thinking about having kids or having kids, the state has skyrocketed in prices. And so the standard of living that they were accustomed to of what a good childhood looks like, regardless of where they were on the income spectrum, is largely out of reach unless they have surpassed their parents in income level. And so therefore it feels like, oh, it's really hard to raise a kid well because it's harder to do what they experienced. What do you think about that? And tell me any other theories around California specific concerns.
What I would say is that I think that if you want to look at it a California concern, I think it affects the population. I think people would rather have kids here, but if they can't, they want the things they remember growing up with. I mean, anecdotally, one of my friends from high school just moved to Arizona. She had her 2nd kid. She's like, we cannot afford in the Bay Area the size of the house with the yard and the quality of schools that we want with 2 kids. So we're going to move to Arizona. So I do think that it affects the population growth and so on and so forth. But I also think that people, even within California, move. I mean, for my dissertation, I interviewed people in Sacramento who were like, I moved from the Bay Area because it was just cheaper. There are places in California that are cheaper. And I think that you see those places have benefited from coastal cities' inability to govern themselves and build more housing and lower prices. What I tell people about the policy intervention is that it's not that you make people have more kids, it's that you make them having kids more pleasant. They're not as stressed about making the mortgage. They're not as stressed about, the quality of their kids' education. They're not, getting an ulcer because they're like, I have to send my kid to private school because the schools are so bad. So I do think that there's some of that, but, I think you make people's lives easier if they could save money. I actually know another couple that they moved to North Carolina because it was just cheaper. They had 2 kids and the husband lost his job and he was like, we basically can't pay the mortgage for 4 months on our savings. We have to move and sell our house immediately because we can live with my family in North Carolina while we get back on our feet. And now they're like, look, we have a beautiful big house, actually now that we pulled the plug on living in California, as much as we miss it, our kids are getting a great experience, and so I do think like the state, by making things cheaper, would make it easier for parents, but neither of those parents that I just listed, I think, want 3 kids. So if you made California cheaper, I don't think that would affect it, Maybe there are some edge cases. I'm not saying that that's no for everyone. The other thing, is that a lot of policies, bring forward a lot of the interventions that they've looked at. It's like, oh, you didn't change total fertility or fertility goals, but you brought forward the age of first kid because you made it more affordable, right?
Yeah.
Like I can now afford having a kid at 30 instead of 35 because I don't have to be as far up in my career. And so what you could say is like, in some cases, and there is some evidence for this, that like, if someone starts having kids at 30, if they at 40 decide that they want to have a 3rd kid, they might be like, look, we had one at 30, we have one at 35, let's give it another go. Who knows? But if you have your first kid at 30 and your second kid your first kid at 35 and your second kid at 40, just the nature of fertility is that it just comes way, way harder at 45. And so bringing it forward can help, the total fertility. But again, it's typically typically people go into having kids already knowing how many kids they want. The biggest correction typically is people actually going down with the number when they see how hard it is and how expensive it is. They're like, I wanted 3 and now I want 2 or 1. And so usually what doesn't happen is you're like, oh, we induced people to have kids earlier. And now they're like, oh, yeah, it's so easy. I'm just going to have more. Because I know usually I think what happens is I think you have to like make things conditional. For someone who always wanted 3 kids, they might not be able to make it happen if they start late because life is so expensive. But you might facilitate that for other people. The thing is that culturally, this is why culture matters so much, is that if everyone you know is having 2 kids, you end up having 2 kids. It's just like sort of like in a lot of other public policies, social determinants of health, whatever, smoking, what you see around you is what you lean towards. So like, I mean, hilariously, like if you just bribed a bunch of people into having the 3rd kid, like if you got a third of Americans to have a 3rd kid, maybe other people are like, oh, so many people are having 3 now. Maybe I should try it. Like, but that's not super feasible.
So if I'm hearing you, it's like oversimplification maybe, but overall, there's no like policy silver bullets to increasing total fertility rate, or at least not strong evidence for any total for increasing that. There are some cultural cohort elements. If you're surrounded or in a subculture with a lot of people having a lot of kids, you are therefore more likely. And there are, you can tweak things at the margins, but if the leaders of California were saying, hey, we want to have more kids outside of making overall life more affordable and things like that, there's no silver bullet that's going to just radically increase the total fertility rate here or in any other US state.
There's basically no silver bullet whatsoever. I mean, if you look at places that did successfully raise their fertility rate, it was what I would call it's like the term in the literature is ECEC, early childhood education and care. You basically build out this entire suite of policies from like pronatal or like prenatal care, quality there, all the way up through like taking care of the kids and having good public education through middle school, right? If you can build this robust policy framework that prioritizes having kids, you can reverse fertility declines. But even then, even in places that are considered some of the most successful implementations of that and have pretty gender egalitarian norms, you still like get to 2 and then it sort of tops out. I even think Sweden, which is like held up as one of the most gender egalitarian and one of the most public policy friendly in terms of families countries, I think their fertility is like 1.9. So you can staunch the bleeding, but I think that you sort of hit a cultural ceiling where you don't want to be the only one having 5 kids. And I mean, you see this decline happening all around the world in places even with high levels of things like religiosity, which are typically correlated. Like Saudi Arabia's fertility fell from like 12 to 3 over 50 years, right? Even in a place where there's, even you have cultural, like other people had big families forever. That would never happen there, right? But it turned out that even in Saudi Arabia, women want to be a part of the workforce. They want to go out, If you encourage women to go to school and to like see what life is like besides just basically being pregnant for 20 years, nobody wants to do that anymore. And so, I think that that's just a big part of it. The other thing I would say is like, in terms of panaceas in California, even making things cheaper, if you saw me looking away for a second, I pulled up just a chloropleth of fertility by state just to remind myself some numbers. I mean, states that are doing wildly different things. Like, during COVID, you had Florida and California get into this big thing about, oh, Florida, we're pro-freedom and we do all this and we have lower taxes and we have better weather and we support kids and you can have vouchers and all that. California's fertility rate is 152, Florida's is 157. They're basically the same. Vermont, an incredibly cheap state, has 1.38. Cost of living alone, there's no single factor that is, the driving thing behind fertility. And that's, I think, what makes it such an interesting topic is that there's no clear solution.
Yeah. Great use of chloropleth there. That's like it's an SAT word. I don't know if I've ever heard that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You out PhD'd me. Okay, so that's really helpful, like an overview of the literature and what the policy solutions or lack of policy solutions there are to this challenge. I'm curious to just talk about, like, getting outside the literature, thinking about the cultural impacts of fewer children. You and I are both multi-generation Californians, and California, particularly in that post-war era, was held up more or less is the best place to raise kids. Like, it had this really robust quality education system. The suburban housing boom was underway with freeways, so you could afford a home but still have access to these world-class labor markets. It was
Uh-huh.
economically diverse. It was ethically diverse. It was a place where anyone could come and raise a family. And it was also had that post-war boosterism, optimism towards the future. Um, and I hear people talk about, and I think about it as well, where having kids invest you in the future generation. Like a few
Yeah.
episodes ago, I was talking to the founders of Grow SF, and one of the founders, his founding story was, I had kids, I cared about the city, I wanted to see it improve, so I left my tech job and just went all in on fixing the city. Right? It was like, for him, that was the
Yeah.
pivotal life moment. And you think, oh, in a counterfactual world where he didn't have kids, maybe he didn't go down that path. Um,
Right.
I'm curious, what do you think are the societal implications of just kids being less and less of a norm and being less common, and how does that shape our view of the future?
Well, I'm gonna not look at the state level. I'm going to go back to Grow SF, right? So there was a stat that people were showing for a while that there were more dog parks in San Francisco than parks for kids. And I think that you can get into a downward spiral in terms of a place growing, in that if nobody else has kids, then there's not robust infrastructure to enjoy having kids. There's not other people to hang out with. You go to the park and it's for dogs, and you're like, where's the playground? And increasingly you're like, well, if I want to go somewhere where there are kids, so you move to the suburbs or you move to a different state or whatever. I think for cities it's been really bad. One of my big issues, I mean, I would say I also used to care a lot more about federal politics, and then I had kids and I'm like, actually what matters is the fact that my kid, there's no sidewalk on the street near me and my kid get hit by a car. Or I care a lot more about the school. I'm way more invested in the success of my daughter's charter school than about federal education policy. So I think that when people have kids, I don't know that they're as invested necessarily at the state level, but I think at the local level they definitely get more invested. And I think that that's good, because if everyone is invested in the cities, then the state benefits, right? I think that a big issue is if you want people to stay in cities when they have kids, you do need to make it more affordable. You need to just build, a lot of the stuff that is built today are 1 and 2 bedrooms because of, I don't know, the incentives of housing and building for young people. They just don't think families want to live in cities. There's not a lot of 3-bed, 2-bath, so it's just hard to find a place to live. And honestly, one of the biggest things that I think cities have failed at is the schools are terrible. I mean, the big
Hmm.
urban cities, not necessarily small cities, but I mean, you care so much about your kid's education, right? And the idea that you can just allow half the city, half of, say, San Francisco's or Oakland schools to just be at the bottom of state rankings, of course people are going to leave for the suburbs, right? There's better schools. And people care so desperately about their kids' education. I mean, my daughter goes to a charter school and you can see it. People work hard to get into the lottery because they are willing to, they're like, I don't have the money to go to private, but there's an opportunity to go to a much better school than the one that's in my neighborhood. So I'm going to enter the lottery, right?
It was almost like a child equivalent to the urban doom loop that people talk about, right? The urban doom loop
Yeah.
being this concept that people were talking about during COVID, where you have businesses, people start to move out, maybe people don't feel safe in the city, and then as that decline begets more decline, right? As businesses leave, there's less foot traffic. The urban core then goes further and further south. And what you're describing is almost like a parallel with children, right? When a city has fewer children, there's fewer parks, there's fewer amenities, there's fewer families raising kids, so that you then feel more isolated raising kids, and makes it even more hostile to having kids in that city, which then just makes it so much worse. Tell me more about your involvement. I know you're talking about caring more about streets and schools. Didn't you do something with your local street sign to try and increase safety on your
Yeah. I
street?
mean, I got into it with the city of Oakland, right? Because there's a street that goes into the local business district by me, right? And it's has a turn like this, and people whip around it really fast, and there's no sidewalk. And the city wouldn't do anything. And I did everything I could the way you're supposed to. I wrote my city councilwoman. I contacted the Department of Transportation. I filed 311 requests. I organized other people to file 311 requests. I did everything that you're supposed to do. And basically, the city of Oakland said, sorry, we score these issues with an equity scoring system. And because you live in a high income neighborhood, your issue is just not getting a good equity score. So you'll never get help. And I'm like, that's a ridiculous way of doing things. But I get it. In other places the situation is worse, but that doesn't mean my situation isn't bad. And so I took it upon myself to add some sort of pedestrian safety stuff. And it's just frustrating because I'm like, I would love for my daughter to be independent enough that she can walk into the business district by herself. But it's not safe. It's not physically safe. Or like, for example, there's a homeless encampment across the street from my daughter's elementary school. And I have been at it with my city councilwoman and the 311 complaint department. And I'm like, this is unacceptable. Like, it's one thing to have homeless encampments all over Oakland, which they do, but across the street from a school, like with little kids, like where you have people doing drugs in the open air. And so I think that those frustrations, like you're willing to tolerate in your 20s to live in a city so you can go out and do fun stuff at night. But when you're a parent, you're like, I don't want my kid watching someone smoke PCP on the way to school. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so I think that if cities want to retain families, they just have to do a better job governing. And so I think that the interesting thing about sort of what you're looking at, which is the future of the state, is I actually don't know that, like, okay, my neighbors that are thinking about leaving Oakland don't talk about leaving for another state. They talk about moving to Marin or the South Bay or what have you. And so the issue is not so much, I think, for the state, but I think you want people to live in the cities because those are the engines of economic growth, right? That's where so much opportunity is. And so you want people to live in cities and you want cities to grow. And so they're not going to grow if you don't have that, So
I almost wonder if the conversation about leaving the state matters more in the less expensive parts of the state, right? So we're like that for the SoCal comparison. I live in West LA. If that's too expensive, then maybe you move to where I grew up in the Inland Empire because it's more affordable.
Right.
But for the families I know in my hometown from the Inland Empire where they can't afford to make it there, there's not much further down to, like, you can go out to Barstow or like deep into the desert or the Central Valley or something. But it's a lifestyle shift. And for a lot of families there, it's like, if I'm doing that, I might as well go to like the North Dallas suburbs, or I might as well go to Texas. So I wonder if it's like you go further down the ladder and then in terms of price, and to the more affordable areas. But then once you're in those already affordable, more inland parts of California, like at that point, you're jumping state lines.
That's the interesting thing about what you mentioned, though, is that there's a difference between affordability and opportunity, or there's a blend, right? You want to go to a city like Dallas because there's jobs, but it's cheaper, right? You could find cheaper in California. You could move, like you said, to Barstow, and it'd be plenty cheap. And so you want places that are both affordable and have opportunity. And I think that there's just been a huge missed opportunity in California to make California cities those places. And so, I think it's a challenge.
Well, on the topic of governance, you talked about paid family leave in California. California has been a pioneer, as they often are, on certain issues, and they've been one of the national leaders on paid family leave. So has it been a success? And tell me more about the way it's governed, the way it's managed. Are there any issues with kind of the day-to-day operations? How has it gone so far for California?
So California was the first state to offer paid family leave. And in 2002, they passed the law, and then it took 2 years to get the program up and running. So it started actually paying out benefits in 2004. Because the United States does not have a federal paid family leave program, it was the first one in the entire United States that was public. And if you ask people who used it, which I did, only 61 people, but generally people like it because who wouldn't enjoy getting paid to spend time with their kid? People support the program. People who used it, people who didn't use it were like, it's a good idea. The frustration that I came across, and this is not just in my research, but as a parent who hangs out with a lot of other parents who tried to use the program or did use the program, the implementation has been lacking. So there are all sorts of issues with how the website works, with getting a hold of someone on the phone when you have a problem and you're not getting your benefits. Issues with employers being frustrated that so much stuff is done by mail. This is just a classic example of, I think, to get on a political soapbox, I think Democrats oftentimes have a great idea, like, let's make paid family leave, and then they pass the bill, and then they're like, okay, it's done. Implementation matters, okay? And so, like, you have to follow up and be like, do people like how this is operated? Is it well operated? Most people say, yeah, it was great. I'm glad I got the money, but like, I really hated the experience of having to go through the bureaucracy. And that's not the brand you want. If your brand is government and people say, I like the benefits I get from the government, but I hate interacting with the government. That's really not what you want. I mean, for example, okay, so if you're a woman and you take leave in California and you have a baby, you can take disability and paid family leave. You get disability to recover from the physical pregnancy, and then you get paid family leave for bonding. Both programs, state disability and paid family leave, are run by the Employment Development Department, EDD. And yet, they have different apps, they have different applications, they have different tracking systems. And most of them were like, the SDI one was great and the PFL one was terrible. And not only did I not understand why I had to transition from one to the other, I didn't understand why one was so good and one was so bad if they're run by the same agency. And so I think that that's like a frustration. I think California has been doing a bunch of things. During COVID, there was as I think people were realizing how the impact on children's development from having to be home, there were some people sort of dreaming big about what to do. And Newsom put out a roadmap for like all sorts of things that would sort of create a holistic approach, like sort of I mentioned, sort of like best practice towards early childhood education and care. For example, making universal TK is like a big one, right? So now in California public schools, you can start, or you will soon, it will be universal. You can enroll your kids in schools starting at 4 instead of at 5. And the governor said that, I mean, one of their goals was to do it by 3 eventually, or at least in some cases. And that's a huge help for families because childcare is super expensive. I mean, oftentimes daycare prices range from $1,500 to $3,500 depending on quality and how much time you use. And so, that's really helpful. But again, like implementation, right? So I know where I live, a lot of people move to my neighborhood because it has a great elementary school. And they ostensibly have a TK program. And yet, so many people I know, their kids, when they were eligible for TK, were like, oh, we don't have room. You are guaranteed right to TK by the state, but because our school doesn't have room, you have to drive 45 minutes to a different school in Oakland that's like way far from your house. It's like, wait, excuse me, what? I paid all this money to live in this neighborhood for the school. And so, how was it that they got so flat-footed that they were like, oh, you didn't notice that like all these young families were moving to the neighborhood, or that increasingly you were getting further and further behind, or had larger and larger wait lists for TK, and you just didn't build out any more infrastructure. And I think this stuff gets caught up in local politics. Like there's a huge fight right now about closing down so in Oakland, where I live, the OUSD enrollment has fallen precipitously in the last 20 years. I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say it's over 10%, right?
And I know a lot of school districts are like that. Like LA USD is going through a lot of similar issues down here.
And it's from fertility declines, where there's just fewer kids, right? And so the city has been trying to close schools because in theory, if you're in a neighborhood where fertility has been falling, but then if you're in my neighborhood where fertility is not rising, people are having kids and then moving there for the elementary school, but you have a higher fertility rate, you have more kids in the pipeline, you should be taking resources from the school where enrollment is going down, and putting the resources to where it's going up to build more facilities, so on and so forth. The politics is too difficult because it looks like you're taking money from a poor district or neighborhood and you're giving it to a rich neighborhood. And just generally, people like their schools. They have an emotional attachment to them. And so whenever they try and close a school, there's this big, brouhaha, and then it doesn't close. And so, yes, they made TK universal. And I think that's a great policy. And, in terms of having kids more affordable, if that is the thing that's hanging people up on not having their next kid, that is a huge factor, especially bringing it forwards, right? But if you then are like, well, we're going to guarantee you TK, but we might make it so that it's so inconvenient that you don't use the benefit, what did you really accomplish? And so I think that is a problem.
Yeah, having to guarantee you TK, but then showing up and not being able to access at your local school. That's like making the rental car reservation and then showing up and they don't have a car, and you're like, what do you mean you don't have a car? Like, how am I supposed to drive?
It's like in LA, it's like you show up at LAX and they're like, no, we have your car, but it's at the Burbank airport. And you're like, wait a second, what? Like, they're like, no, we said we would get you a rental car. We just didn't say it would be at the airport you're flying into. What made you think that would be where you got your car?
Yeah.
And so parents are frustrated. And then I think it discredits, the idea of policy when you implement it really, really poorly. Then people lose faith in the idea that policy can have a positive impact.
Yeah. And I know that's such a bigger conversation happening right now with abundance and these other things, but it's so true, right? Like even just macro scale, people talking about Newsom's hopes to run for president.
Yeah.
Like high-speed rail in California. It's easy to make fun of it and mock it, but
Right.
like 30 billion without any functional trains going anywhere.
The train to nowhere.
That's all people know. Like so many people aren't following policy closely. They don't know the intricacies of all of their favorite programs. All they know is like California, didn't you spend tens of billions of dollars on a project that doesn't work? Don't you waste, billions of dollars on these different things? Like that project alone, I feel like will set back the hopes and ambitions of what people think the government can achieve in the future because they just think, oh, when we try big things, it goes really horribly. Versus in previous eras, it's, the successes build on each other. When you can build like the UC system or, like the California Aqueduct or these other large scale infrastructure projects of various sorts, you do that, you succeed, and then people have more belief that the next grand vision will actually translate into reality. But when you don't actually deliver on any of your promises, they'll believe your promises down the road.
Yeah, or if you're trying to market yourself, like I think back to the implementation thing, it's like if you're like, well, we passed California paid family leave, we're so great and progressive, you're gonna find 100 people who are like, this was my terrible experience with the program.
Yeah.
And then it's just from a marketing perspective, you have a hard time, getting support or building on that, and like I said, all the people who took it were like, I'm so glad I got it. Why did you have to make it so hard for me? Right? Like, there's just such easy and obvious fixes. Like the one I talk about that they're thinking about changing. They haven't changed it yet. There's consideration, but you can't apply for your parental leave benefits until after you have the kid. And if it's your first kid, there's like nothing more disorienting than like entering parenthood and being like, oh my God, I'm responsible for another life. If you're a woman, you just gave birth, you've got postpartum depression, you have physical recovery, you have all these things going on. And you like are supposed to be filling out some paperwork online and jumping through like a bunch of bureaucratic hoops. Like, why would you do that? Why don't you let people fill out the paperwork 14 days, like within a window beforehand? Like, I don't know. Like I always say, I'm like, maybe they are worried that you won't have the kid won't like survive childbirth and then you would get benefits for nothing. I'm like, fine. If someone lost their child during childbirth, just give them the money as a, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Also, infant mortality is incredibly low. So that's a ridiculous reason to have that as a burden, right? And how much harder would it be to allow people to send in the application earlier? Like, come on, state of California. Yeah. And so, it's just, I think, easy stuff that there's whatever the bureaucratic holdups are. I don't really understand.
And no one would ever design the program that way intentionally. It's always like this downstream effect of like a bunch of small decisions made by different legal departments. No one's sitting there like, it'd be perfect. What if we take, women who are in the most like fragile physically and emotional state after giving birth and force them to go through the DMV twice, right? Like no one's sitting there concocting that as a brilliant policy scheme for how to help mothers in a very progressive fashion.
No, probably what happened was they were like, well, to be eligible for the program, you have to have had a kid. So we will just make you have to have had the kid before you can apply. And like, that seems straightforward in that meeting. But then what's frustrating about, I think, public policy in general, too, is it's like right now they're researching whether to change it. Right. This is like, you mentioned abundance. Was it the fetish for proceduralism? It's like, why? Just change it.
Yeah.
It's really stupid. Like, it's really hard to understand why there's just less action on things. And, and that's what's frustrating. Like, so I pulled up this list that they made of things that they care about on this California for all kids, great start for their future. And, it says we want to provide comprehensive early learning for and care for infants and toddlers. Every family should be able to access those. We want to promote readiness for like academics for everyone, grow the quality, size, and stability of the workforce, right? So this has actually been a big problem with implementing the TK everywhere, is also just not enough qualified teachers. So, they have these goals, but then when you see how they implemented other things, it's like, do I trust you to do that right? Like, okay, for example, right? This is, if you want to go to a classic economics public policy argument, is Build a competency-based licensure and workforce development system. Okay, look, you need more people desperately to work in taking care of kids. And I get that there should be a threshold of competency for doing this. But also, occupational licensing throws up all of these burdens, right? And I just don't really believe that you're helping. Like, maybe to a certain degree, like, you don't want the person to be like, I'm an ex coal miner 70-year-old man with a felony record. Yeah, obviously that's a no. But being able to be good with kids is not actually necessarily something you have to go to school for. And also, occupational licensing as an infrastructure, it costs money to run the infrastructure to make sure that that happens, but it also costs money for people to get all that stuff, and that gets passed on to the consumer. I mean, this just kills me. Okay, so in terms of the cost of childcare, right? What happens is, like, I pay a ton of money for childcare because my kid goes to a licensed daycare where everyone complies with all the rules. In doing so, which is insured and so on and so forth, and they've probably got all sorts of liability issues they're worried about. And a lot of places won't even rent to a daycare because of the worried about lawsuits, and so they have to pay a bunch. Okay.
And the ratio of teachers to students,
the ratio, etc., which are all laws that were passed in good faith. Every single one of the rules that when you stack them all up, each one was passed in good faith. But because I'm just gonna make up an example. This is what I always do. I say, look, let's say a kid choked on a marble at a daycare. Then the news gets out, and someone in Sacramento says, we need a law that says that there cannot be marbles at daycares. And then someone at the daycare has to spend their time making sure nobody accidentally brings in marbles. They have to have a marble inspector come and make sure there's no marbles. And you end up layering all this stuff up. And then it becomes really expensive and difficult to comply. People are like, I just don't want to open a daycare and deal with the hassle, right?
Yeah.
So then you have a really expensive tier for the people that comply. And then for people who can't afford to comply with that, there's these unlicensed ones that aren't following any of those rules anyways. Yeah. You've created this huge black market for daycare where people are like, I don't have a license, but I'm really good with kids. And through word of mouth, people just trust me with their kids, and I run out of my backyard, and there's none of those rules being enforced.
I love the image. So who did you... like black market daycare is such a funny phrase, but no, it's totally true.
Who did you help? Who did you help, California, with all these rules? And again, I'm not saying there should be no regulation, but the amount of regulation that you've put on daycares has created a two-tiered system that is not working for anyone. You have the one group that is paying a ton of money and it's barely affordable for them, and they're unhappy with the cost, which is almost, if not more than their mortgage in some cases, especially if you have two kids. And then for the other people, they're not getting any of the benefits of all of the regulations that you think are important because it's too costly to implement them. Yeah. So it's a lose-lose. And so, I don't know, it's frustrating that everything, I think a lot of these things are done in good faith. Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want to help kids? Who wouldn't want to protect kids?
For the children, Noah, for the children.
Yes, for the children. And so I understand the politics of passing these laws. Looks good because it looks like you're helping kids and nobody wants to vote no. And then what you end up is hurting kids because you've made their parents' life financially stressful, or you've put them in these completely unlicensed places where, I mean, it's probably fine, but if you believe those things matter, then you've driven them out of, if you believe that licensed daycares are important, you've driven people away by making them too costly.
There's a parallel here to cannabis, children and cannabis, the two canonical policy case studies.
Classic,
and all.
Classic.
Yeah.
I mean, gummies, kids
exactly.
Gummies.
Yeah, there's some overlap in the Venn diagram, but California had a black market pot market like every other state that had where cannabis was legal. They legalized it, and as part of legalization, it wasn't just, hey, we're going to legalize it and bring it out, but we're also going to add on all these requirements. A lot of municipalities looked at it as a way to generate revenue, so they're going to pass fees. Yeah. Someplace it made it like an equity thing. We're going to have special programs so that people who are harmed by the war on drugs.
Only if you're a queer ex-felon of color can you open a cannabis dispensary. That's what New York did, and you know what? Anyways, I'll let you finish the story because you know where this is going.
No, but yeah, and then even like just the additional licensing and testing requirements, all these extra fees made it so much more expensive. The consumers were like, well, I'm not going to stop going to my local weed guy I previously was going to when it's 3x the price or whatever for the legalized stuff. And so you can have a similar dynamic where the people who are playing by the rules are paying enormous costs and are struggling with consumers, and the black market that you were supposedly flushing out is continuing to thrive. And so then, the people who are playing by the rules are pissed off. They're like, hey, there's the unlicensed weed shop down the street that you're not cracking down on.
Yep.
So anyways, kids and weed.
Yeah.
That's a...
I mean, the parallel is apt. I mean, it is true. Like, it's happened here. It happened in a lot of states that legalized. New York, they had this really equity-based program for who was going to get licenses. And then what ended up happening, it took so long that a bunch of unlicensed ones just opened up and basically established their brands and, so on and so forth. By the time the ones that got opened by going through the process were there, they couldn't compete with the unlicensed stores that were just thriving. Or, you mean, not to say they all went under, but this has happened in Oakland. Some of the dispensaries that were like touted for, being owned a small business, black owned small business, so on and so forth. They're like, I went out of business because I'm competing against the unlicensed people, and you don't do anything to enforce those. So you don't end up helping anyone. And so I think that I remind policymakers that sometimes simpler is better.
Yeah.
I mean, I joke with people all the time about the California paid family leave one again. Like, for example, there's like a 4-tiered benefit system that's based on your average quarterly earnings of the first 4 of the last 5 quarters. Like, and your pay band, your remuneration rate is a reflection of the proportion your income is of the statewide annual average quarterly earning in that quarter. People are trying to figure out if they can pay the rent while they are on leave, and you've given them this absurdly complicated system to navigate. And the state says, well, there's a calculator. And then people I talk to were like, yeah, there's a calculator. And they're like, how much do you make? You type it in and they're like, this is what we think, but there's no guarantee that that's actually what you're going to get. And by the way, there's like a bunch of questions they ask and they might not even know the answers to the questions. So it's just frustrating. I think you can be well-meaning and want to help kids, but I don't know that you are actually helping kids.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to end on a sour note. What are some of the things that give you hope about the future of California and things that you hope we see improve during our lifetime, by the time our kids are old enough to complain about policy when they're our age?
Well, the weather here is probably going to be good for a long time despite climate change. So I think we will still have that relative to other places. I mean, you mentioned the Grow Us Up thing. Yeah, I think people are increasingly frustrated, and it has taken surprisingly long for the feedback loop to catch up with policymakers. But I mean, if you look at what happened in San Francisco with the most recent election, I mean, you can even go back to the special election before that on the, when Chesa Boudin got ousted for his super overly progressive prosecutor sort of ideas. And for example, back to the schools, the board of the supervisors for schools there, superintendents or whatever, 3 people got ousted because of 2 big things. One, they spent a bunch of time during COVID debating whether to rename the schools and not reopening the schools. And they wanted to remove the merit exam for getting into Lowell, which is a really excellent public charter that you have to get in via a merit exam. And I think there was that. And then the most recent election where basically anyone left of center just got ousted. And, some of the most anti-growth people, the biggest sort of NIMBY people on the board of supervisors all lost their jobs. And Lori won. And I mean, people are tired of it. People are like, I want my city and the place I live in to do better. And for example, my city councilwoman, who I've sent a lot of emails to, there's stuff that she's mentioning now, public safety is her number 1 issue now, and we need safer streets. I think people are getting the message, but even stuff like permitting reform. I was looking at her, she's running for re-election, and one of her top issues is permitting reform. Some of the nuts and bolts of what I think is making things hard that are not the sexy parts of policy are getting more attention. And I'm hopeful that the more city council people are like, oh, actually, we need to make it reform permitting so that it's profitable to build housing for people. I think that's good. I think the YIMBY movement has woken a lot of people up to some of the esoterica of what we need to do. So I think I'm optimistic that policymakers are starting to get frustrated. And I think Gordon Newsom, you mentioned his political aspirations. I think that he knows that you can't run for president and have 100,000 unhoused people in the major metro areas.
Yeah.
And so I think that I'm optimistic that things are trending in the right direction. I think people are frustrated. I'm overall bullish on California cities. I think that people are frustrated and things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you're right. And I similarly, it's good to hear that permitting reform's on the menu. It's putting butts in seats in the Oakland local
That's
elections. It's getting
right.
people excited about the nuts and bolts, as we're both nuts and bolts kind of guys. Yeah.
I have been to city council meetings now to advocate for my various issues, and it's impressive anything gets done, but you have to do the minutia of being like, you are thinking about passing this permit rule that will actually make it harder to build things, and you just so much as it can be frustrating to have to get involved, you got to get involved. You have to go to these meetings because those people listen.
Yeah. Well, Noah, appreciate your time. Appreciate you talking about all this, and
of course,
glad that we're able to stay in touch.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, man. It's been good.